Chapter 26 Vondales and the Elk.
"Maybe you should have wished us a way out of here,"
Cody said as they rushed back down the hall to the doorway to the ravine. It was standing open and the sound of clashing steel echoed off the walls.
"How did you get it open?"
Haille asked.
"We didn't," Val said. "We looked up and it was opening on its own. When we looked back, Katlyn was healed and headed your way."
"I don't remember much, just the light, and the pain was gone and my fingers tingled. But I knew I had to get to you. I knew you were in danger,"
Katlyn said.
"We're all still in danger. Stay behind us,"
Val said. Vondale's men, better trained than Redmont's, were making it a fierce battle, despite their disadvantage of numbers. Numerous bodies from both sides littered the ground. Redmont's men blocked the main pathway out, making a stand in the narrowest part of the ravine. Val and Cody armed themselves with the swords of dead men. Red was nowhere to be seen, but her father was behind his men, shooting around them with a crossbow.
"Let's take one of these shafts," Val said, turning to one of the smaller openings.
"We don't know where they go,"
Katlyn said.
"We'd stand a better chance against the dark than against that lot,"
Cody said. They made their way, feeling along the walls in the darkness, dusty stone and splintering braces passing at intervals. Haille was relieved when he heard the sound of rushing water and could see the flicker of torchlight ahead of them. The shaft opened up into the cavern filled with the rock-crushing machinery, the belts still running although no one was left to tend to them.
"Come on,"
Val said, striking out across the floor. They rushed beneath catwalks and around wheelbarrows full of rubble to a bridge that crossed the river that powered the gears of the conveyor belt. They were almost across when Vondale stepped out of the shadows. Blades descended from his forearms, the muscles of his shoulders bulging and pumping with his racing pulse. His eyes fell on Katlyn, and his face flashed confusion for a moment before he sprang at Cody. Vondale's was calm, a seasoned fighter and efficient as a predator. Cody, caught off guard, scrambled to deflect his blows. With his blades fastened to his mangled hands, Vondale's was one with his weapons. They were extensions of his body, and he fought without extraneous movement or panicked reactions. Cody stumbled, fell, and dropped his shield after a shocking blow from Vondale's. Vondale swept his blades past Cody and was stopped short of slicing his neck only by Val, who came crashing in with an overhead blow to Vondale's shoulder. His layers of plate and mail held, though, and Vondale shrugged off the strike, then swung at Val, forcing him to weave away. Vondale stomped on Cody's fallen shield, caught it as it flipped upwards, and flung it at Val, who ducked. It was just what Vondale's wanted, for while the captain was bent over, Vondale's leapt in the air, bringing both blades down on Val's neck. They stopped before reaching their target. This time they were stuck in the antlers of the elk. It had galloped in so quickly Haille had not even taken notice until the elk swept into the center of the battle and sparks were flying off its crown. Val hurried to help Cody to his feet while the elk and Vondale's became lost in their own confrontation. By the way Vondale's hissed, spat, and growled as he fought, the enmity between the two was clear. The elk was not defenseless. He dipped, swung, and jabbed with his antlers like a battery of spears and swords, deflecting Vondale's strikes and making his own. The caverns echoed with the clash of steel on antler, hooves on stone, and the shattering of rocks in the still-turning grinder. Vondale's let out a cry of exultation when he scored a strike on the elk's head, leaving a red gash on its face. Vondale's held up his ruined hands.
"A few more of those and we'll be even, Adamantus."
The elk sought new ground, clambering up a set of stairs, sure-footed as a billy goat, and ran out onto a catwalk that spanned the rumbling conveyor belt. Vondale's followed. At the same time, Silas and two men entered, their own armor dented, scratched, and splattered with blood. They had either fled Redmont and his men, or defeated them. Whatever the case, Vondale's rallied them, calling out,
"The elk! Kill the elk!"
"Not if we have anything to do with it," Val said, and with Cody rushed the trio. Silas stepped out to engage them both, meeting them on the bridge over the water. The other two climbed the ladder to the opposite end of the catwalk and closed in on the elk.
"He miscalculated,"
Haille said, crouched behind a boulder.
"Who?"
Katlyn asked.
"The elk. He's trapped."
Vondale's crept in, waiting for his two other men to stalk the elk from behind. The elk kept its head turned sideways, watching the approach from behind and before it, all the while backing up and away from Vondale's, whom it must have perceived as the greater threat.
"We have to help,"
Katlyn said.
"Follow me."
Haille sprinted around a barrel of rusted shovels and pickaxes and leapt over a wheelbarrow before reaching the creaking conveyor belt with its whirring gears and spinning wheels. He grabbed a rock as it moved past and flung it at Vondales. It bounced off his armor harmlessly, but came close enough to his face to give him pause. Katlyn followed suit, reaming the other men with rocks. Not as heavily armored as Vondales, they each raised their shields sideways to deflect any additional stones as they rushed the elk. It was just the opening the elk needed. As they approached, it tipped forward towards Vondales and kicked out with its hindquarters like an angry donkey. It caught the first man in the chest, sending him tumbling into the second, who lost his footing entirely, flipped over the handrail, and plummeted through the air into the rushing water where he disappeared in the white spray. Vondales rushed forward and stabbed again at the elk's face, only to be frustrated by the rack of antlers. He drove his blades further this time, locking them up and twisting the elk's neck. The second man lifted his sword to stab downward, but the elk stopped him short with its leg. The animal did not escape unscathed, for the blade grazed its leg and a gash opened there. But its attacker overcompensated while righting himself and had to grab onto the shaking handrail. Cody had just reached them and kicked Vondale's man before he could steady himself and sent him tumbling over the handrail. His body flipped once in the air before he struck his head on the conveyor belt and landed, unmoving, on the floor. Vondales flexed his arms and twisted the elk's neck. The elk shuffled its hooves and tried to realign its body, but Vondales had leverage on his side. They were locked in a stalemate, pushing against one another. Cody, in an effort to upset the balance, swung his sword into the nearest handrail, snapping it. The catwalk shook and pitched dangerously to the side, but still Vondales remained locked with the elk, sweat beading on his forehead, fresh blood dripping from his blades, the tendons in his neck taut, his remaining fingers curled into incomplete fists. But the elk was not out of tricks. It pushed forward and blew a stream of air out between its lips before it rose up on its hind legs. Antlers, blades, and Vondales lifted into the air while all their weight teetered on the elk's two rear legs, like a circus performance. Then the elk wildly wheeled its front legs and struck Vondales once in the mouth and again in his chest. One of his forearms let out a muffled crack and bent at a grotesque angle until a jagged white bone stabbed through the skin. Vondales cried out as one blade, then the other slipped free of the antlers with a noise like a sword being sharpened. He fell through the air before crashing onto the conveyor belt, his body lying uneven on all the rocks below him. He moved with a groan and a rattle of armor, pulling himself onto his elbows where he realized he was moving towards the heavy rollers cracking rocks into dust. He swept past Haille, reaching out, rocks falling beneath him, frustrating his every attempt to get off. He fell on his broken wrist and cried out. In a desperate last bid, he reached over the edge of the moving belt for anything, anyone. Katlyn was there. She had run down the length of the belt and met him towards the end where she took his good hand in both of hers. Before Haille could ask her what she was doing, she turned to him. "Help me!" Somehow, to his own surprise, Haille found himself wrapping Katlyn's hands and Vondale's in his own while he anchored his feet against the side of the belt. He pulled with all his weight. For a moment he was looking into Vondale's face. How transformed it was. Red, desperate, scared. Gone was the man who had hurt so many others, and in his place was a frightened, pleading boy. Perhaps that was what Katlyn had seen right away, and so she had not hesitated to act. But both her feet and Haille's were slipping. The gears of the belt were turning with loud squeaks, and the rocks under Vondale's were rolling. His broken hand was useless, but he tried to use his elbow to reposition his grip with Katlyn and Haille. But with such few fingers, his hand failed him. He turned over briefly when he knew he was moving inexorably towards the tiny gap between the rollers. Katlyn looked away, her face in Haille's chest, as Vondales kicked out at the machine only for the spinning rollers to draw his boot in between them with a loud crunch. Leather split at the seams of his boots, followed by the sound of metal popping as his greaves were drawn in as well. The wheels jammed briefly, but mechanical force won out in the end, and the rollers continued spinning, great bloody swaths left on their impervious faces. The elk limped its way down the catwalk. Cody swung down on a loose cable. Silas, realizing he was now outnumbered, turned his back on Val and ran into a shaft, his footsteps echoing after him. At the same time, more of Redmont's men appeared from the direction of the mine's entrance. Val rallied their numbers in the center of the room. "We'll make a break for the other side, where we came in," he said. but their plan was thwarted when Silas reappeared with his remaining companions. Arrows started to fly across the chamber between the two sides.
"Do you have a different plan, sir?"
Cody asked Val as they all hid behind the conveyor belt. Val ducked an arrow that flew overhead in the crossfire, and another bounced across the floor, landing near their feet.
Nothing brilliant comes to mind just at the moment. We could wait and let one side finish the other," Cody suggested. "Leaving us to fight the winners. I don't like our odds."
"How about we swim?"
Katlyn yelled over the din of the machine.
What?
Val and Cody asked in unison. Katlyn pointed at the white frothing water coursing through the center of the cavern.
"It has to come out somewhere."
The elk huffed and snorted.
"Did he just nod?"
Cody asked. "It's foolhardy," Val said.
"It might be our only way,"
Katlyn said.
"After all, I'm hoping the goddess didn't heal me just to let me down."
With that she ran, head down, across the cavern floor to the river and jumped, disappearing into the sluicing wash. With a clatter of hoofbeats, the elk followed. "I'll be damned," Val said.
"Is this our plan?"
Cody asked. "It's mine," Haille said before he stood up, sprinted under a catwalk, and jumped over the edge to follow. Chapter 27. Garn's Grange. Haille's world was swirling darkness. The cries of men, the clash of arms were replaced by the rush of water, the roar of rapids, and this hiss of froth. He tumbled through tunnels with sides that had been smoothed by centuries of flow. There were no handholds, no pools to surface in, only swiftly moving subterranean darkness, without air, without light. More than once he was thrown up against a boulder or other barrier of some sort, the force so great that he was sure he had broken a rib. It became near impossible to hold his breath. His lungs burned as if doused in acid. The darkness that surrounded him subsumed into his consciousness. If he did not gasp for air soon, he would surely black out and the result would be the same. And then the water was still, and he floated to the surface, and air, wonderful air, was on his face, bubbling in the water and blessedly in his lungs. He took in great mouthfuls of it while the current carried him under an archway of stone and into light. The water grew shallower, and he felt himself bump along the gravelly bottom. A figure of fur and steel loomed over him, snagged his collar, and soon the elk was drawing him to a rocky shore where Katlyn was laying, her chest rising and falling, her hair a mess of wet tangles. Haille took in deep gulps of air while lying beside her. He said nothing. Instead, they listened as the elk stalked back into the water, the current eddying about its long legs while it pulled Cody, then Val, from the water and placed them on a rocky ledge a little further downstream. The four of them safe, the elk returned to a spot next to Katlyn where it folded its legs and sat, waiting as they recovered. Haille did not feel inclined to move. His eyes stared up at the blue sky, his heart still pounding in his chest. He could feel his pulse in his neck, and hear it in his ears. The elk tore at some grass growing out between two rocks and began to snack on it.
"Why did you do it?"
Haille asked.
"Do what?"
Katlyn said.
"Reach out. Help him,"
Haille said, knowing he did not need to mention Vondale's name.
"Especially after what he did to you."
Katlyn held up her healed hand. Nothing short of a miracle, yet neither of them knew just how it had happened, just that whatever it had taken to save her had cost the Font, cost Jasmeen, the extent of her powers.
"I didn't do it for him. I did it for me."
"I still don't understand."
"I didn't want to be like him. I got to thinking about what Val and the Knights of Oban would say. All life is precious, even your enemies. If I had watched him die without trying to help, I would have been no different than him."
Haille thought on it a while. "I guess I'm not that different. I wanted him to die."
"But you still tried to help. Only because you did."
She laid her hand on his.
"That is all that matters."
Haille could have stayed there longer. He could have slept until the next dawn, but Val and Cody eventually crawled up the rocks, dripping, exhausted. "It's best we move out before it gets dark," Val said, still breathless. He looked at the elk, chewing grass. "Some elk."
"I'll say,"
Cody echoed. "We can camp tonight farther down the mountain. It will be warmer. Then we need to make for Rivertown."
"I know just the place where we can stay,"
Haille said. Lorna, Sorrel, and all the other members of the house staff welcomed them to River Ridge, bringing them changes of clothes, hot food and tea, and bandages for their wounds. While Lorna rubbed a salve on Haille's forehead, she asked, "Did you find the healing you were looking for?" Haille thought carefully, his skin tingling from the salve. "Yes and no. The font, it worked, but I used my wish for someone else." "After you rest, you four can tell me the story in its entirety." The next morning, after sleeping late and partaking of a large breakfast, that was exactly what they did. Val, Cody, and Katlyn filled in the gaps, explaining how Red had traded them to Vondales. "He and that Sade fellow were brothers, I figure," Cody said. "Aye, by the look of them." "What happened to Sade?" Val asked. "I don't know. He fell into the water, but who knows where it carried him," Haille said. A silence settled over the table, and Haille felt cold even with the morning sun streaming in through the window. "At the least, I think the Redmonts won't be causing trouble for us again." Cody pulled an imaginary dagger and gave a smile. "I didn't see where Red went," Katlyn frowned. Lest gloom settle over all of them, Lorna began to clear the plates from the table and signal to Sorel. "Refresh our friends' teacups. Then you lot ought to sit out in the sun, soak in its warmth, and dispel the cold of the mountains from your bones." They followed her instructions. Cody wandered down to the bank of the Liam, where some young women were beating laundry. Their laughter reached Haille, Katlyn, and Val where they had taken seats on the gallery, facing the shining sun and the mountains in the east. Val shook his head and grumbled something into his teacup before he got up and walked across the swale of grass to the riverbank to retrieve Cody. For a while, Haille and Katlyn sat in silence, listening to the chirping birds and the crowing of a rooster in some unseen courtyard. The ladies along the water bade Cody a farewell in high, sing-song voices as Val drew him back towards the main house. "Such a nice place," Katlyn said. "Really? It seems empty to me. Like the heart's been torn out of it," Haille said, looking on the windows behind him that caught the sunlight that shone into empty rooms. "Lorna called it a place of mourning." Katlyn shrugged and sipped her tea. "Mourning? Despair? Someone once told me those sad things make up the soil in which the seed of hope germinates." "You've come back to life as a philosopher, Katlyn," Haille smiled. "I'll settle for friend." Haille looked into his cup, his countenance darkening. "What's wrong? Did I say something to upset you?" Katlyn touched his arm. "I've done wrong to many people on this journey, and I've been lucky to make things right with some, but not all." "Gone?" "Yes. I wonder if he has survived his wounds." "There is one way to find out," Katlyn said. "We need to be moving back west to the city anyhow." "True," Haille said, draining his cup and looking over the river that sparkled like beaten gold, the mist rising like smoke from Thestos, and finally the mountains mingling with clouds so that sky and earth were indistinguishable. "But there is a part of me that wishes we could stay here forever." Lorna accompanied them back along the trade road, riding on horses Yona herself had broken. With their wild flight and 2 captivities, it was not easy to find the way back to Garn's Grange, but the elk was with them and proved to have a knack for finding the way, not unlike a bloodhound on a trail. So it was on the evening of their 3rd day out that they turned off the main road, down a lane lined with hedgerows, and emerged on a familiar homestead. The children, whether they were Garn's or his farmhands, were first to spot them, staring wide-eyed at the elk who led the way. By the time the group reached the main house, Garn's wife was waiting in the doorway, flanked by her helpers. She was stone-faced, her expression a mix of resentment and worry, not welcome. Haille dismounted and dropped to a knee. "My lady, we owe you a debt," he said. "You are bold to return. If my husband were not ill, he would run you off. I wish that I could." "Then he lives still," Katlyn said. "No thanks to those of you who took advantage of him." Lorna had already slipped down from her saddle, drawn her medicine kit from the saddlebags, and slung it over her shoulder. She marched towards the door without slowing and without waiting for invitation. "I will allow you all to work out your amends. In the meantime, let me see to my patient." Something in her bearing moved Garn's wife to step aside, allowing this indomitable woman with amulets of silver and bone to walk into her home. Haille was ready to wait, but Lorna called after him. "Come, Haille. Sorel is not here, so you will have to serve as my assistant." They found Garn in the same room, under the same windows as Aurora had been. Father seemed ready to follow daughter to the land of shade, for he had grown thin, his complexion waxy, and the skin around his wounds red and inflamed. Lorna clucked her tongue as she peeled back the bandages and examined the tears that the dogs had left in Garn's flesh. His wife stood in the doorway, her hands balled into fists at her sides. Val and the others had followed her and stood behind her in the hallway. "We beg of you, my lady, an opportunity to set things right," Val said. "Lorna is a skilled healer." He lifted his own sleeve to show a fresh bandage she had changed just that morning. "She has helped us with our injuries." "This will take all my skill and some luck as well," Lorna said, shedding her cloak and rolling her sleeves. She touched Garn's forehead. His eyes fluttered, lost in a fever dream. "Haille, hand me the maiden wort. Katlyn, fetch me some water." She looked to Garn's wife. Something in Lorna's expression asked the question for her. "My name is Merrilee," Garn's wife said. "Merrilee, boil some wine and find me some mouldy bread." The wine and mouldy bread made a concoction that smelled of vinegar and rotten stockings, but after bathing Garn's wounds in it, the redness began to subside. Lorna put Haille to work grinding rosemary, horehound, and saxifrage in a mortar, then mixed the powder with flaxseed oil that she spooned into Garn's mouth. She massaged his throat until he swallowed it, and then instructed Haille to squeeze out cherries and reduce the juice to a syrup over a brazier. Lorna stirred in ginger water and tinctures of chalk from her medicine kit. Katlyn tended to the children of the farm while Val and Cody helped by doing chores normally left for the man of the house, chopping wood, baling hay, and repairing shingles on the roof in preparation for winter. So much help did they provide that some afternoons before she started to prepare dinner, Merrilee would be free to sit in the sunroom with Haille while he changed the moist cloths on Garn's head. With time, her disposition towards him softened. "So you are truly a prince, related to the king," she said one afternoon. "Yes," Haille said, unsure how to react. Merrilee crossed her legs and arms and leaned her head back upon a cushion. Haille was glad she seemed at ease. The last thing he wanted was for her to treat him differently, especially in her own home. "You were born in a storm," she said, not taking her eyes from her husband. "I was. It was from whence I was named. My father said I should be named after the bite of the storm." She said, resting her chin on her hand and turning her gaze to Haille. "Garn thought you were a healer because there are legends about a storm-born prince." "There are?" "Yes. Superstitions, you city folk would call them. Nothing the Inquisitors would approve of." "I've come to realize I am no friend of Inquisitors," Haille said. "The stories say the storm-born prince would have power, that he would be a healer," she said, now resting her hand on Garn's, who twitched in his sleep. "I pray it is true." Haille reflected on her words and for a moment remembered the cloud of flame that enveloped him without burning him, and Sade's words, "You have the gift of power." But before he could reply, Lorna entered. "Enough idleness," she said. "Haille, where is your pestle and mortar?" Garn finally woke after 4 days of ministering to him. It was early morning. The house was quiet but for the creak of the floor as Haille sat up in his chair, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The stars still hung over the trees. Haille stared out through the window panes at the vast purple sky, and then back at the sleeping form of a giant man, lit by candlelight. A man who stirred and was no longer sleeping.
"Water,"
Garn croaked. Haille scooted his chair back and rushed for a calabash and held it next to Garn's lips. He drank, the lump in his throat dipping with each swallow. When he opened his eyes, he focused on Haille and he spoke in a stronger voice.
"You."
"Yes," Haille said, looking up from under his brows.
"Am I dying?"
"No, I think you will live." Haille smiled and offered him more water. "Thanks to Lorna."
"Who is that?"
"A healer, a friend who has been aiding you."
"Yet I wake to you,"
he said, his mouth twisted, quizzical. "I've been her assistant. Would you like me to get Merrilee? She will be pleased to know you are awake."
"Yes, but wait. Why did you return?"
Haille put down the calabash and rubbed his palms across his knees. "I cannot make your family whole again, but I can try to leave things better than they were when I left you. You helped us, after all." Garn nodded. his lips working against one another as if he was chewing a thought. Whatever it was, he kept to himself. Haille crossed the room to the doorway. "I'll get your wife." Merrily was just rising, starting the fire in the fireplace in the kitchen when Haille found her. Her face was still lined from her pillow, but she straightened, fully awake when Haille told her, "Gon has awoken." In the growing light of dawn, Haille could see her tears drop from her face as she leaned over her husband, whose eyes were still too dry for tears, but the expression on his face was unmistakable joy.
"Oh, a long night has passed,"
Lorna said from behind Haille in the doorway. He jumped a little. He had not heard her creep up next to him. "Your powers compare to Jasmeen's," Haille said, leaning against the door jamb.
"You exaggerate, and you know it."
Haille reached for Lorna's hand. "This gives us leave now to return home."
"It gives you leave, and leave you must."
"Why not yourself? Yorna would want to see you."
"Would she? I doubt that. She might not want the reminder of a life that is past. I have no doubt she loves us, but we only remind her of what she lost. A past she can't get back."
"But you," she said, touching Haille's cheek.
"You are the future. You are the promise."
Dizzy with lack of sleep, and still wearing an apron from his last session of grinding cherry pits for Lorna's potions, Haille hardly felt promising. Really, he felt tired and said so, rubbing his eyes.
"You will have no time to rest,"
Lorna said, her tone firm.
"You must leave today. Your father marches to war and your place is beside him. He is in grave danger."
Haille turned back to the reunion between Garn and Merrily and blinked his burning eyes.
"How do you know this?" "I saw it in a dream."
Haille twisted his mouth as if he was sucking a lemon. He resisted what first came to his mind regarding superstitions, old wives' tales, and the inexact science of interpreting dreams. But as if she read his mind, Lorna gave his face a gentle slap.
"Have you not learned by now that there are powers unseen, forces at work that are beyond your ken? Forces that folk of our kingdom fear?"
"I have.
But dreams?
I have dreams, but they don't necessarily come true."
"You tell Yorna that I saw your father march to war amid banners and a host of 1,000 men. But he is surrounded by death and danger, and only you might be able to save him. Then listen to what she says."
"You are sure you won't come with us?"
"No. My place is here with my patient. But for you, it is with your friends, and it is time for all of you to depart."
Chapter 28. A Journey South. Katlyn stopped on her own doorstep, her hand hovering just short of the handle. "What are you waiting for?" Haille asked her. He could hear voices and the clatter of dishes inside and smell a chicken roasting over the fire. His stomach growled. They had pushed hard to reach the city, home, especially after Lorna's premonition. Haille was weakened, hungry, and tired, yet on reflection he could understand Katlyn's hesitance better than he let on. After so long away, after facing so many ordeals, they both felt different. Yet the city, for all its business, was the same. When she knocked on that door, when Haille returned to the castle, would they lose the people they had become? Return to their old identities?
"I don't know," Katlyn said. "I just feel like it's not my home any longer."
She knocked on the door, like a stranger. Haille heard her aunt exclaim from within, "Who could that be?" Katlyn's cousin Jessamy opened the door.
"Katlyn!"
There was a rush and then a crush of bodies in the doorway. Tears, embraces, laughter, even a scolding followed. Haille nearly disappeared, unnoticed in the chaos, until wiping her eyes, Katlyn's aunt, a sturdy woman with strong arms and wide shoulders, asked,
"And who is your friend?" "This is Prince Haille."
Haille felt he was the only one who was eating. Whether it was his own presence or the story Katlyn was weaving of their adventure, Haille could not be sure. But Katlyn's younger cousin sat enraptured, the food on their plates growing cold. Her Aunt Elise could not eat for the way her hands covered her mouth, leaving her eyes exposed, showing her worry and concern. Her Uncle Rickard was more somber, looking over at Haille more than a few times, as if to take his measure. Katlyn left gaping holes in the story, purposefully, to omit the gravest dangers of Haille's own poor decisions. He noticed magic and the more fantastic elements played down. When it came to her own wounds, Katlyn omitted them completely. This left the question of just what had transpired in the chamber with the font. Elise uncovered her mouth long enough to ask Haille if he was indeed healed. No, he stammered. I think it was just a legend. Katlyn was finally able to eat while Elise, Rickard, and the children took their turns filling them in on all that had transpired in the past weeks. The news of war in Carith, the king calling his bannermen and marching south, the rumors of discord on the council. It made Haille anxious to make their exit. But the timing of family was not the timing of the individual, something Yona had taught him long ago. So he waited, picking at the chicken bones on his plate, looking into the fire, and listening to the laughter and the expressions of love around him. It was happiness balanced on the edge of a knife, he thought, for it could have been such a different homecoming had the font not worked one last miracle, had it not read his heart correctly, had he wished wrong.
Haille,
Katlyn said, kneeling down beside him. He realized he had been lost in thought for longer than he had intended.
Jasmeen will take your message to the castle, to Yona.
She put her hand on the shoulder of the girl who had opened the door to them, the same girl who had opened the shutters to him that night so long ago when Haille had discovered his father's letter. She was already dressed in a traveling cloak and boots.
Thank you. Tell her to meet us at my mother's tomb,
Haille said. Jasmeen went right out of the gate, while Haille and Katlyn went left, back the way they had come. They headed out of the city, crossed the Drimmondale, and turned north into the flattened, harvested fields of wheat. It was dark, but it was easy to move by the light of the moon, which was half full. The chaff at their feet was a ghostly white as they approached Worthorn Forest, and the grove of evergreen trees that surrounded his mother's tomb was the color of blue ink. The air was heavy with the smell of fir and cedar as they walked the path between moss-covered stone walls into the clearing. In the center of the space, catching the moonlight and reflecting it in a soft glow, was an obelisk. It would have been the height of 6 men if it were not intentionally broken in the center, like the wound it represented. Val and Cody waited at the base in reverent silence. Behind them grazed their horses and the elk. Even more than the white marble of the monument, the elk's antlers shone in the light like a crown.
Why here?
Katlyn asked, the obelisk reflecting in her eyes. It is away from the city. No prying eyes, and Yona would know where it is. Haille stopped. He knew there was something else, but it was difficult to put into words.
And I guess it all started with her, my mother, and I felt our journey should end with her as well.
If this is truly the end, Val said, turning his head to the sound of a galloping horse. Yona rode into the clearing on Greywind, dismounted in a smooth, practiced motion before the horse had even come to a stop, and let her momentum carry her forward in a run until she could wrap Haille in her arms. As she did, a familiar chirping came from overhead, and Haille felt the dance of bird feet on his shoulders.
Baby jays,
he said, drawing back and holding out his arm where Azure let out a loud twilling.
They have missed you,
Yona said, studying his face and brushing the hair from his forehead. Her brow furrowed and her mouth opened to form a small O as she detected the cuts and bruises on Haille's face.
You have been through things,
to say the least, Haille said. Yona turned in Val and Cody's direction and promptly fell to her knee, her head bowed.
My lord!
Val and Cody exchanged a glance between them, and Val reached to help Yona up. We are no lords, my lady.
I kneel not to you, but the Stygorn elk behind you.
Sty what? Haille said. The 2 men parted and turned to regard the elk, who remained in place, its eyes fixed on Yona. The jays, curious, left their perches on Haille to flitter through the elk's antlers as if they were at play in a mulberry bush. The elk snorted and stomped, taking a step towards Yona. She rose, touched its face, and stroked it the way Haille had seen her do with countless horses. I don't understand, Haille said.
You have seen an elk like this before? Only in story. He will reveal himself as needed.
She turned back to Haille.
Now you must tell me everything.
They sat in a circle, and unlike earlier, Haille and Katlyn presented the full, uncensored version of events. Haille beginning with the letter he read in his father's chamber and picture of the font he found in the library. Haille closed with Lorna's vision.
She insisted that my father is in danger.
Then he is, Yona said, steely-eyed. You have that much confidence in the woman? Val asked.
Completely.
Yona went on to explain all that had transpired in Haille's absence. The threat of war from tribes invading from the steppes east of Carith and south of the Rimker Range. The dissension on the council. Haille's own disappearance was viewed as a possible kidnapping by enemy forces.
No, if anything, we were kidnapped by supposed allies, Haille said of their imprisonment by the Chancellor of Kinth. And Annabeth Chastain mentioned her contact with you not at all, even though she has been elected to council, Yona said.
There is a woman who seeks the throne, Val said, standing, his arms folded across his chest.
If something were to happen to the king, that could be exactly what she is positioning herself for. And she is allied with these men. You called them the Servar, Haille? What again was it that Sade wanted you to wish for?
The power of the Kryen. Yona stood, the folds of her cloak straightening around her, and walked to the edge of the clearing, looking once at the elk, then off into the darkness of the forest. The treetops stirred in the wind. So what is our next move? Val narrowed his brows. It was Katlyn who spoke first.
We must reach the king. If he is in danger, we must warn him.
But danger from what? Val asked. Lorna's prophecy is vague. The dangers of battle are many.
Maybe it is dangers from people he trusts,
Cody said. He is my father, Haille finally said, staring at the ground in front of him, then turning his eyes to his friends. As imperfect as he is, I must help him.
It is too great to risk,
Yona said. The jays made the only noises, chirping to one another as they traded places in the branches of the elk's antlers. Katlyn stood as tall as she could and, lifting her chin slightly, said in Yona's direction,
Would you deny a son's opportunity to aid his own father, his only remaining parent?
Yona turned, surprise on her face.
I am looking out for his welfare, as someone who loves him as a son.
Katlyn held her gaze.
So don't consign him to the fate of losing both parents.
Yona cocked her head sideways, as if perplexed by this child so unafraid of her.
Who are you to speak to me so?
Yona asked.
I speak as a friend,
Katlyn said.
And I, his family,
Yona said, her eyes holding a liquid gleam. In his mind, Haille saw the empty rooms of River Ridge she had left behind, the furniture draped in dust covers, the only movement being the sunlight filtering into those abandoned rooms. A place with a heart torn out. Haille passed by his mother's tomb and placed his hand on Yona's shoulder. At the same time, the elk moved a few steps closer. Yona. She stiffened and then sighed.
Katlyn is right. You must go. You left the boy. You returned a young man. Sometimes those closest to you are slowest to realize the change. Forgive me if I still look at you and see a boy in bindings.
I am who I am thanks to you. She turned at that, touching his hand and squeezing it.
You leave with great companions who will protect you well.
She looked past him to Val.
The Knights of Oban are an honourable brotherhood. I know the prince is in good hands.
Cody cleared his throat.
And it's good to have some hands around that can sometimes get dirty.
Undoubtedly,
Yona said, walking back into their midst.
But you must leave tonight. Dalamar has a long lead on you. The elk could catch up on his own, but on horses you will be slower.
We might take the forest road, Val volunteered.
You speak of dark paths then, but I see no alternative myself. You will find enemies in all places, but hopefully friends as well.
I'll hold out for friends. I like to consider myself an optimist,
Cody said.
Surely,
Yona said.
Haille, listen to your friends. Take the jays with you, for they will be needed, and follow the elk.
All of them looked at the noble animal, who suddenly shook its head so that the jays took to the air. It snorted and scraped at the ground with a hoof. He is eager to leave then, Val observed as the elk marched through their numbers to the edge of the clearing. The others mounted their horses, Katlyn the elk. Haille remained next to Yona.
Will you be all right?
Do you not wish to come with us?
I do, but someone must mind the council.
Then I will see you when we return, Haille said. After a final embrace, he mounted his horse. The elk was already trotting out past the mossy walls and through the forest. Val and Cody kicked their horses to follow. Haille looked back at Yona, her lavender cloak silver in the moonlight, the broken promise of his mother's tomb looming behind her. He spurred his horse, grabbed hold of the reins, and rode off.